A man who threw what turned out to be tomato juice at UK women's rights advocate Kelly J. Keane and Tanya Sturt, one of the organisers of Let Women Speak event at Auckland's Albert Park in March last year, has been convicted of assault charges against the two and was discharged earlier this week. We touched on it a little bit yesterday. The attack by Eli Rabushkin sparked hundreds of angry protesters to push down barriers separating the protesters from those who came to Albert Park to hear Miss Keane and to speak about threats to women's rights they have experienced. No one was able to speak because protesters were very loud and mayhem shut down the event. In the violence that followed, Miss Keane and her supporters had to physically force their way through the baying mob and get to safety in a car. Also that day, the violence against mainly older women sent a shockwave throughout New Zealand, especially when video footage emerged of a young man among the protesters repeatedly punching a 71-year-old woman in her face. He was later discharged without conviction. Miss Keane left the country fearing for her life, and death threats were delivered to her hotel room. Police told her they couldn't guarantee Miss Keane's safety. Later that day, she tweeted, "My activism is simple. We, #LetWomenSpeak. Why does that make anyone so angry? We show the world what happens to women when they try to speak. No one can pretend they don't see the salivating misogyny." And that word, misogyny, the meaning of hatred of, aversion to, or prejudice against women, and in most extreme forms, misogynist terrorism and femicide. It's popping up more and more. As I said, governments around the world are now taking notice and thinking of classifying it as a form of misogyny as extremism. Women's Rights Party co-leader Jill Ovens says Albert Park lifted the veil over extreme misogyny, which has been flourishing largely underground in online spaces, both internationally and here in New Zealand. And she joins me now. Jill, a very good afternoon to you.
Yes, good afternoon.
It's great to talk to you again, Jill.
Yeah, I wrote that because I was really annoyed with the media coverage on mainstream media of this. Radio New Zealand just picked up the Herald story, which repeated the way that they've played down what happened at Albert Park last year, and they continue to play it down. And so they talk about what happened at Albert Park as a raucous speaking event and counter-protest. And the fact of the matter is no one got to speak.
No.
And also, the format of that Let Women Speak events that Kelly J. Keane runs is quite an amazing format when you think about it, because she doesn't speak for very long. She has an open mic and women come up and they tell their experiences, they read out their poetry, they sing songs, and so, as she said herself, why does that make people so angry? And it's because they don't agree with what she's saying, and so it's hugely intolerant, and the violence that we saw that day is misogyny as far as I'm concerned, and I think she got it right when she said that.
Jill, can I want to talk about that, but firstly, can I ask you what you make of what the judge handed down to Eli Rabushkin? Chose not to impose a penalty, but received a conviction and discharge for his crimes. But he could have got a maximum penalty of 6 months in prison or a $4,000 fine. So what do you make of that?
Well, that's part of the thing, that they tried to portray it, and her defence successfully portrayed it as a low-level offence. Now, no one was to know that it was tomato juice. And
no,
actually, the fact that could have been acid.
Could have been acid,
someone's pointed out that tomatoes are acidic. Well, but anyway, probably not that acidic. But the thing is, we later find out that Rabushkin is a pharmacist and chemist, so that would be more worrying if we'd known that at the time. But it wasn't to be known at the time. It was very scary for those people on the actual rotunda, and I saw it happening.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that's when the barriers were getting pushed down. And you should have seen the look on the people's faces. They were really angry. And I'm talking about the protesters who keep getting called trans rights activists, and I object to that as well, because they were anti-women protesters, pushing down those barriers, determined to shut us down, silence us.
Yeah.
And that, that turned out to be a worldwide embarrassment because it got carried all over the world. And, we're supposed to be a tolerant country, known for our kindness. Well, that certainly wasn't kind.
No.
So why no, that was discharged, there was no penalty, is because the defence portrayed Rubushkin as doing so much good work in the trans community, and much was made of what he'd been through in his home country of Colombia before he came here. But one of the things that annoyed me about the coverage was that if you go on the Herald website and look at the story, there's a video there of him with tomato juice on the table. And just more or less gloating. It's called Dear Posey, and accusing her of genocide and saying, this whole thing about New Zealand is his safe place, or her safe place, depending on how you portray it. The Herald, of course, says her safe place. Well, what about safety of those of us, the rest of us? Aren't we entitled to safety?
Jill, can I ask you though? Globally, we seem to be seeing growing violent events. We saw the Bondi Junction mall attacks earlier in the year where women were targeted. Most recently, that terrible death of the Olympic runner Rebecca Cheptegei, who was set on fire by her ex-boyfriend and later died. But Jill, as horrific as these events were, is it fair to call it misogyny or just very, very disturbed people that happen to be men?
Well, what drives people to do things like that? And, there is quite a bit of evidence that boys are being more or less groomed by social media, which is, associated with the far right. It's not very far from being a white supremacist in terms of racism to being a misogynist. And that's actually, funnily enough, what I wanted to talk about that day in Albert Park, because there was all this stuff about the Nazis and those neo-Nazis who went to the Melbourne.
In Australia, yes.
Yeah, and then all we heard about was...
them.
No, that's right. And so I wanted to point out to people that Nazis, exterminated women. They were hardly a friend of women and our children, and that neo-Nazis are the most misogynist group you would ever meet. Yeah. And, so there's this undercurrent of what's called the manosphere, and there is a woman called Laura, I've forgotten her second name right now, Laura Bates. She's written a book called Men Who Hate Women, and she's actually, she posed as a 24-year-old male, and she went on these, the manosphere, and discovered, just how disturbing it is. And of course, one of the problems is that you start watching a YouTube video and it's just unfiltered and it clicks on to the next one and the next one, and you just, through algorithms, just go further and further down the
rabbit hole.
What we call rabbit hole,